been too long since we talked about a warship. Let's do that. USS Maryland was the second ship in the Colorado class and the third to bear the name of the seventh state. Since I've already done a video on the Colorado class as a whole, the stats and figures of the ship have already been discussed, so we'll go ahead and jump right into the history of the ship. She was laid down on April 24th, 1917, launched on the 20th of March, 1920, and commissioned on July 21st, 1921. She was the third ship to bear the name, after the sloop USS Maryland of 1799 and the armored cruiser of 1905. Following her commission, she went on a shakedown cruise along the East Coast. She was made flagship of Admiral Hilary P. Jones and proved quite popular for special occasions, including the 1922 U.S. Naval Academy graduation, the anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill, Boston's 4th of July event, and other events of the like. In August and September, she transported Secretary of State Charles Evan Hughes to Rio for Brazil's Centennial Exposition, her first visit to a foreign port. Afterwards, she joined the Pacific Battle Fleet, continuing in its role as flagship until 1923, when the flag shifted to USS Pennsylvania. 1925 saw visits to more foreign ports, this time to Australia and New Zealand. The ship returned to Latin America in 1928, transporting then President-elect Herbert Hoover on the Pacific leg of his tour of the region. 1928 also saw the beginnings of an overhaul in which her 3-inch anti-aircraft guns were replaced with the 5-inch 25 calibers. The 1930s were filled mostly with training and patrols. In 1940, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships changed their base of operations to Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. This decision would prove fateful. December 7th, 1941. The combined air groups of 6 Japanese flat tops attacked the U.S. installation at Pearl Harbor, alongside most every other U.S. military redoubt on the island. Maryland was moored on Battleship Row next to Ford Island. USS Oklahoma was to port and was connected by lines and gangways. To her front was USS California, while aft were USS Tennessee and USS West Virginia. They had just returned from fleet maneuvers, and most of the crew were getting ready for shore leave, or were eating breakfast when the first Japanese bombs fell. As the first explosion rocked the American fleet, Maryland's bugler blew to general quarters. Seaman Leslie Short, who was addressing Christmas cards near his machine gun, brought the first of the ship's guns into action, shooting down a K torpedo plane that had just dropped against Oklahoma. Since Maryland was between her and Ford Island, she was protected for the moment from torpedo attack. Maryland brought all her anti-aircraft guns into action. Oklahoma was utterly demolished in the first strike, and she rolled over and capsized quickly, trapping many of her men inside. Survivors from the ship climbed aboard Maryland to assist in her AA fire. She was struck by 2 armor-piercing bombs, which detonated low on her hull. The first struck the forecastle awning and made a 12-foot by 20-foot hole. The second entered the hull at the 22-foot waterline at frame 10, causing flooding and an increase in forward draft by 5 feet. Despite her damage, Maryland continued to pound away with her anti-aircraft guns and sent damage control parties to Oklahoma to attempt to rescue survivors. 2 officers and 2 men were killed during the attack. The Japanese claimed it sunk, but the ship entered Puget Sound for repairs on the 30th of December, just behind USS Tennessee. During the repair, 2 of her 5-inch 51s were removed, and her 5-inch 25s were replaced with 5-inch 38s. She received many other repairs and overhauls over the next 2 months, including new firefighting equipment. She was complete on February 26, 1942, and undertook another shakedown cruise to the Christmas Islands. She was ready for action in June of that year, the second Pearl Harbor ship to re-enter action. She would play a small role in the Battle of Midway, operating with a backup fleet protecting the West Coast under Admiral William S. Pye. Afterwards, she was sent to San Francisco. After the Battle of Midway, she was almost constantly training with Battleship Divisions 2, 3, and 4 until the 1st of August. She returned to Pearl Harbor for repairs, her first time returning to the harbor since the Japanese attack. She and her sister ship Colorado left in November, heading for the battle area. She took part in a line crossing ceremony before steaming for the Fiji Islands for patrols. The 2 battle wagons acted as sentinels against Japanese incursions threatening Australia. After the success of the Solomon Islands campaign in early 1943, the Americans went on the offensive. In February, the 2 sisters moved to New Hebrides, taking station off Efate. The heat in the area proved to be an issue for the crew. She then moved to Espiritu Santo to guard against Japanese incursions and keep the Allied base there safe. However, heat and heavy rain continued to plague her. Then the 2 ships moved towards the Aore Islands in August. She would return to Pearl for a 5-week overhaul where several 40mm guns were installed on the top deck and foremast to defend against Japanese air raids. On October 20th, 1943, the ship left the Hawaiian Islands for the South Pacific. Maryland served as the flagship of Rear Admiral Harry W. Hill's 5th Amphibious Force and Southern Attack Force during the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. She also had aboard 2nd Marine Division Commander Major General Julian C. Smith and Colonel Evans Carlson, commander of Carlson's Raiders. She met the task force at Efate before departing for Tarawa. On November 20th, 1943, the Battle of Tarawa began. Maryland's guns opened fire at 0500 hours, destroying a shore battery on the southwestern point of Betio Island in the atoll. At 0600, she commenced shore bombardment to soften Japanese defenses ahead of the American landings. Maryland moved closer to the shore to attract counterfire and proceeded to rake the gun emplacements that did so, along with control stations, pillboxes, and any other Japanese positions she could spot. At 0900, the Marines hit the beaches, entering into one of the bloodiest battles of the theater. Much like their Army comrades at Normandy 8 months later, the Marines faced a vicious crossfire. Maryland's big guns helped eliminate several Japanese machine gun nests, and her float planes began to cover the Marines' progress. Maryland continued to give artillery support. The plane, however, was damaged and the pilot wounded during the action. She covered the invasion of Betio Island for 3 days before moving on to It'll be on the screen. To do much the same. The Marines met only light resistance from a handful of Imperial soldiers there, and 2 prisoners were brought on board Maryland. On December 7th, she left for Pearl, and then for San Francisco for repairs. Maryland headed for San Pedro on January 13, 1944, to rendezvous with TF-53 at Lahaina Roads to load ammunition, fuel, and provisions before heading for the Marshall Islands. On the 30th, she, the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, and the light cruisers Santa Fe and Biloxi moved to support the landings on Arroyo. This squadron formed the northern group of Task Force 35. Before dawn on the 31st, the squadron began a bombardment of Kwajalein Atoll, and the battle for Kwajalein was on. Maryland destroyed several stationary guns and pillboxes. She fired so many of her main battery rounds that the linings of the guns on turret number 1 split. On February 1st, she continued fire support while U.S. troops advanced inland. During the next 2 weeks, she served as the flagship for Admiral Connolly and resupplied and refueled many other ships in the operation. She departed on the 15th of February for Bremerton, Washington to undergo another overhaul, as well as replace the damaged guns. In May, she joined TF-52, headed for the Marianas, under Vice Admiral Richmond K. Turner. For 3 days, TF-52 bombarded the island of Saipan, starting on the 14th of June. They quickly destroyed several coastal guns before moving on to Garapan, where they shot up gun positions, ammunition dumps, storage tanks, small boats, blockhouses, and the like. Maryland then turned her guns to Tanapag and gave it the same treatment. D-Day in the Pacific occurred on June 15th, with Maryland's 16-inch guns firing in support of the landing force. The Japanese attempted to deal with the battleships with air power, a strategy that had proven devastating 2.5 years earlier. On June 18th, she shot down her first Japanese aircraft. 4 days later, a Mitsubishi G4M3 Betty flew low over the hills and spotted her and USS Pennsylvania. It dropped a torpedo and blew a large hole in Maryland's starboard bow. Casualties were light. 2 men were killed in action, and in 15 minutes she was underway to Oneontauk and then to Pearl Harbor. She had to do this in reverse the whole way, so no further damage was done to her bow, and she was escorted by 2 destroyers. Working around the clock, the dockyard workers got Maryland back into fighting shape in 34 days, and she departed on the 13th of August, 1944. She headed with the task force to the Solomon Islands and then on to Palau in September. She joined Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's Western Fire Support Group Task Force 32.5. On September 12th, she provided fire support for minesweeping and underwater demolition operations during the opening stages of the Battle of Peleliu. She again provided shore bombardment fire on the 15th of September. 4 days later, organized resistance collapsed and the ship retired to the Admiralty Islands. Afterwards, she joined Admiral Thomas Kincaid's TF-77.2, which sortied on October 12th to provide gunfire support for the invasion of Leyte. She entered Leyte Gulf on October 18, 1944, taking position between Red and White Beach to open fire ahead of the invasion, which was set for 1,000 hours, October 20th, 1944. When the American forces had their beachhead, she took up a sentinel position in Leyte Gulf to defend against Japanese seaborne counterattack. And counterattack the Japanese did. American submarines spotted elements of the Japanese Northern and Center Force closing in on the Gulf. On October 24th, 1944, Maryland, her sister West Virginia, and the battleships Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania sailed to the southern end of Leyte Gulf under the command of Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf to protect Surigao Strait alongside several cruisers, destroyers, and PT boats. Early in the morning of the 25th, they encountered the Japanese Southern Force, still licking their wounds from attacks from American aircraft. The force consisted of the battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, a heavy cruiser, and several destroyers. At 0355 hours, the Battle of Surigao Strait commenced. The waiting American ships pounded the two Japanese battle wagons with gunfire and torpedoes. Fuso quickly succumbed to the fusillade of American torpedoes launched from the destroyers. Yamashiro also succumbed to the weight of American firepower. A few Japanese ships fled into the Mindanao Sea, pursued by Allied aircraft. This would prove to be the last major battleship versus battleship action in history, a mere 38 years after the launching of HMS Dreadnought. Maryland continued to patrol the Surigao Strait until the 29th, when she steamed for the Admiralty Islands for resupply. She continued protecting the beach-headed Leyte until the 16th of November. On November 29th, during a Japanese air attack, she was struck by a kamikaze. The plane crashed between turrets 1 and 2, piercing the forecastle deck, main deck, and armored decks, and blowing a hole in the 4-inch steel and starting several fires. 31 men died and 30 more were wounded in the attack. The medical departments were also destroyed, but the medics were okay and could still treat the wounded. She continued her patrols until December 2nd, when she and 2 heavily damaged destroyers returned to Pearl Harbor for repair. She reached Pearl Harbor on December 18th and was extensively repaired and refit over the next couple months. After refresher training, Maryland returned to the Western Pacific at the beginning of March 1945, arriving at Ulithi on the 16th. There she joined Rear Admiral Morton Deyo's TF-54, part of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, which was preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. The fleet departed on the 21st. Maryland was assigned targets on the southern coast of Okinawa to support a diversionary landing in order to distract the Japanese, confuse them of the actual landing location on the west coast of the island. Japanese airstrikes countered the bombardment, and her 2 radar picket destroyers were hit with kamikazes, one of them, the Luce, sinking. On April 3rd, she was sent to assist the Minneapolis in destroying several shore batteries. She remained off Bolo Point, providing artillery support for advancing troops. Maryland continued in her fire support duties until the 7th of April, when she and TF-54 were moved north to possibly intercept the Japanese Tengo fleet. But considering the American carriers got to them first, they didn't have much to do in this particular engagement. At all. Anyway, at dusk, a kamikaze crashed into turret number 3 from the starboard side, wiping out the 20mm mounts and setting fire to the area, which quickly cooked off the 20mm ammunition. 10 were killed and 37 injured from the attack, with another 6 missing. Turret number 3 was damaged, but still usable, but to be on the safe side, the captain decided it should remain silent until repairs could be made. She remained on station for another week, providing artillery support, in which she endured several more air raids. On the 14th of April, she left the firing line to escort returning transports to Pearl Harbor via the captured Marianas. She put in at Bremerton, Washington for extensive overhaul. Her 5-inch guns were replaced with 16 5-inch 38 guns in twin turrets, and turret number 3 was repaired. Crew quarters were also improved. Her repairs and upgrades were completed by August, and she had set out for training cruise and test runs when the Japanese surrendered, ending World War II. Next, like every American ship at the end of World War II, she did a stint as part of Operation Magic Carpet, bringing 8,000 servicemen home. She completed her Magic Carpet duties on December 17th. In mid-April 1946, she re-entered the Puget Sound Navy Yard and was placed in the inactive reserve in mid-July. She was decommissioned about a year afterwards in April 1947 at Bremerton, where she became a member of the Pacific Fleet Reserve. She stayed there until July 1959, when she was sold for scrap to the Lerner Company of Oakland, California. On June 2, 1961, Governor J. Millard Tawes of Maryland dedicated a monument to the ship and her men, which holds the ship's bell, located on the grounds of the State House in Annapolis. And there you have it. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, check out all my social media stuff. I'll see y'all in the next video. Bye.